voting rights back, the court would say, we just can't deal with this. It's not our problem. And historically, at least since the 60s, courts have been much more engaged about protecting voting rights. This would mark a real kind of retreat from the effort to protect suffrage and a signal that the courts have just sort of given up on protecting the right to vote, and they're willing to let states just sort of go hog wild in disenfranchising whoever they want.
Now's a good time for us to take a quick break. We'll be back with Mark Joseph Stern in just a moment. Don't go away.
Civic Tech 101 interviews individuals working in the public and nonprofit sectors to understand how technology is being applied to social problems, for better or worse. From analyzing open data to applying algorithms, we cover approaches and projects that are having a significant effect on how the nonprofit and public sectors function. Our interviewees explain the benefits of their work, the limitations of technology, and how to get involved. From publishing open data to combating disinformation, we talk with people who use data to help others, always distilling actionable information from complex ideas. If you're interested in the civic tech space and want to learn more about the current initiatives, then keep listening. We'll connect you with the key ideas that you need to know.
And we're back with Mark Joseph Stern, a writer for Slate. His new book is American Justice 2019, The Roberts Court Arrives. So the Federalist Society is getting increased scrutiny for its almost official role in judicial appointments. Why has the organization been able to become so powerful? And what does this influence convey about the direction of the Republican Party and the courts?
So the Federalist Society presents itself as a nonpartisan group of attorneys who like to essentially hold debates at law schools about pressing matters of the moment. And to some degree, that is true. If you go to a law school campus in the before times, before COVID, you'd probably see signs for a debate about, the constitutional right to vote, poll closures, take your pick. And it may well be sponsored by the Federalist Society. And those events are perfectly fine. I certainly have no problem with them. But there's another side of the Federalist Society, and it's essentially a massive network of conservative attorneys who lift each other up and help to get each other key positions in the pipeline to the federal courts and then ultimately on the federal courts. It was founded in the early 1980s by conservative attorneys and law students who felt like the legal world had just gone way too far to the left, that just the courts, the law schools, law school faculties had all been pulled into the far left, and there had to be a counterweight. That's why the Federalist Society existed back then. What's happened is that today, or for many, many years, the Federalist Society was run by a guy named Leonard Leo. Leonard Leo is a behind-the-scenes operative. You probably or may not have heard of him until recently, at least. He was truly a figure in the shadows. And he was a whiz at building up these dark money networks that could be tapped to help to gather conservative law students and lawyers together, bring them to the same rooms, and have them figure out how they could help each other, and then work with publicity organizations, campaigns, politicians, activists, and spend a bunch of money to try to support conservative legal causes and conservative judges. Today, you see ads on TV supporting Supreme Court nominees. That is a new feature. That is not a long-standing feature of our democracy. That's the kind of thing that Leonard Leo dreamed up. He figured out how he could try to bend public opinion by taking millions of dollars from donors. We don't know who they are because it's all dark money. This is all done under the guise of a nonprofit network. But he will basically take that money, pick certain people who he thinks are consistent conservatives. They oppose abortion. They support gun rights. They oppose LGBTQ rights. Those are three baseline requirements to be tapped by Leonard Leo. If he likes you, he will tap you. He will help to put you on the court. And then he will run ads against senators who vote against you. So it's like a one-man shop for the entire kind of pipeline from cradle to grave, from the first day of law school to your appointment on a federal bench. And there's absolutely no liberal equivalent to that. There's no liberal Leonard Leo, and there's no liberal Federalist Society. The American Constitution Society is often compared to the Federalist Society. It is very, very different and much less influential. So think of the Federalist Society as a group to whom the Republican Party has essentially outsourced the task of vetting judges. It is a group that figures out who is going to vote against abortion rights and LGBTQ equality and so on, and finds a way to put them on the bench and, if necessary, take down lawmakers who might vote against them.
You actually started addressing my follow-up to that. You brought up the American Constitution Society, and I wondered if you could talk about why progressive efforts like that one have thus far been largely unsuccessful, and also what could Senate Democrats be doing better to counteract efforts of the Federalist Society to confirm people such as, recently, Justin Walker to the federal courts?
So I think the easiest answer is just money, right? Leonard Leo, and I sound conspiratorial when I say this, but I encourage you to read the Washington Post deep dive into his whole network. He's really good at creating multiple front groups and funneling money back and forth between them and moving that money ultimately into the pockets of very important and influential people. And liberals just don't have billionaires who they can tap at least as readily as Leonard Leo can. Whoever these guys are who are hiding behind this whole dark money scheme, they are willing to give tens of millions of dollars each for the cause of getting conservative judges on the federal courts. There's no liberal equivalent. You don't see a George Soros getting super involved and engaged in judicial issues. But I think it's more complicated than that. I think there's also a psychological aspect to it, which is that the Federalist Society, despite being one of the most powerful and influential groups that has ever existed in the United States today, considers itself to be an underdog. Members of the Federalist Society consider themselves to be underdogs. They are almost uniformly aggrieved and feel victimized and vilified, and they believe that they have to work together as a scrappy gang to fight against the mass of liberal lawyers who are out to get them. And that, I think, is a very powerful psychological motivator, because most people go to law school, they take the classes, they might join a law review, they enjoy the experience, but they don't leave law school really tightly affiliated with any particular group. If you go to law school and you join the Federalist Society, you really do become thick as thieves with your fellow FedSoc students. And you really sort of become a club. The Federalist Society clubs are quite insular on most law school campuses. And when you leave, you keep in touch with those people, because those people are going on to really important clerkships. I didn't mention this before, but many, many Trump judges, George W. Bush judges, they go around the established process for selecting law clerks, and they just reach out to Federalist Society members in law schools. They don't care about following protocol. They just want a good Federalist Society member as their law clerk. No liberal equivalent to that. And so these Federalist Society members are sort of inculcated with the idea that they have to fight every single day of their lives because their views are unpopular, they are correct and righteous, they are trying to restore an originalist understanding of the Constitution. It's almost a religious mission. It feels like a Middle Ages crusade. And so they leave feeling like they're going to take all that they've learned and all of the friends that they've made and all of the contacts they've made. They're going to use that to continue to push for a conservative revolution in the law. And liberals just don't have that. Liberals are like, okay, maybe I'll join a firm, maybe I'll get a clerkship, maybe I'll go into public service. But they don't leave sort of breathing fire the way that so many Federalist Society students do.
Especially since judicial appointments go through the Senate, we know that the upcoming elections will be critical for the future of America's judicial system. But we are also in a unique situation around voting, as the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed many states to change voting procedures and embrace more widespread vote by mail. What do you think the effect will be of this quick expansion of vote by mail? And how can we still have confidence in the election if people can't go out to vote in person the way a lot normally would?
So I'm a big proponent of vote by mail. I think if you look at states that have implemented universal vote by mail, whether they be conservative like Utah or more progressive like Washington, it works really, really well. But we have learned over the past few months, as other states have rushed to try to move elections to vote by mail, that it's not so easy to set up that kind of system overnight. I live in the District of Columbia. We had elections on Tuesday, and they were an absolute mess because the city encouraged people to register and apply to vote by mail. The Board of Elections was totally overwhelmed by the influx of applications. They didn't send out all of the ballots that they were supposed to, and that forced thousands and thousands of people to wait in lines that reached more than 5 hours long to cast a ballot in person. Something somewhat similar happened in Wisconsin, right? Different situation in Wisconsin. There, you had an effort to postpone the election due to COVID-19. The state Supreme Court overruled that postponement and had the election continue in early April, really at the height of that wave of the coronavirus pandemic. And you had a real conundrum with voters who applied to vote by mail, wanted to vote by mail, did everything right, but election day came around and they still hadn't received their ballot. And just like in DC, the Board of Elections just didn't have the personnel, the resources, the time, or the money to send out all of the ballots that had been requested because there was such a surge in requests. And that was a recipe for just a total legal nightmare. Basically, it was a legal meltdown because you had people who had tried to vote by mail, who couldn't get their ballots. Suddenly it was election day. It was cold in Wisconsin. The coronavirus was still raging, and they had to choose between either going to the polls and risking a vote in person or forfeiting their right to vote. That is a terrible quandary. No citizen should ever be put in that situation. I certainly hope that other states learn from what happened in Wisconsin and what happened in DC. These primaries in some ways are a test run for the general election in November, when the stakes will be much, much higher. And I hope that states figure out how to streamline the process because Trump is out there claiming that vote by mail is rife with fraud. He is incorrect. That is objectively false. But if states can't figure out how to do this cleanly, then more and more people are going to turn against vote by mail. And I fear that will have catastrophic consequences because when done well, it probably is the best way to run an election.
One final question. Let's suppose that Joe Biden wins and Democrats take the Senate. What do you see as some of the most significant steps they could or should take to combat the influence of the Federalist Society and the control of much of the federal judiciary by members of this organization?
So the number of seats on the Supreme Court is not fixed in the Constitution, right? It's gone down to as few as 6 sitting members and as high as 10. And in fact, Abraham Lincoln added a seat to try to dilute the influence of conservative Southerners on the court. So if Democrats decide that the Supreme Court has essentially gone rogue, that it has overstepped its bounds in a truly egregious and unforgivable manner, they would be totally within their rights to add 2 seats to the Supreme Court, or 4 seats, or 6 seats. There is obviously a practical reason not to do that, because as soon as Republicans take over, they could just turn around and add even more seats. And I think that is a genuine problem. But I also think that the Democrats should not talk about court packing until they are ready to do it. I don't think that the Democratic Party really gets much out of floating the idea of court packing when it's just an abstract theory, because it does frighten a lot of people. I think FDR's experience with it shows at a minimum that Democrats have to be really careful about framing it as an effort to restore the rule of law. And I think it would have to be a reaction to a universally abhorred Supreme Court decision rather than a proactive effort to dilute conservative influence. More modest reforms would include expanding the size of the federal courts of appeals, which would be a much less dramatic step and is something that many presidents and Congresses have done in the past. Jimmy Carter, for instance, expanded the courts of appeals and appointed a large number of liberal judges. Most cases end at the federal courts of appeals. The Supreme Court only takes about 70 cases a year. So adding seats to those courts and putting centrists or progressives in those seats would end up undoing a lot of the damage that Donald Trump has done and diluting a lot of the influence